The Long Dark is indeed a fascinating world full of mystery and promise, with several stories waiting to be told, riches waiting to be unlocked, and in this video I aim to do just that, by unlocking the layers to this world, from the humble beginnings of industrialization all the way to where the wintermute mode had left us. The Long Dark isn't just an exceptional open world survival game, full of attention to detail and a captivating gameplay style, but a game full of interesting lore with some dark moments sprinkled in. So journey with me today as we look toward Great Bear Island and the mysteries held within. In the 1860s, a man known as Spence had begun traveling to an island off the northwestern coast of Canada within the Pacific Ocean and Ring of Fire. He had been accompanied by his wife, children, and a number of workmen. It is unknown where the family and their workers had landed on the island. However, what is known is they had traveled to the region that would be later known as Full-on Muskeg, where they began building the first of many settlements, which would be known as the Old Spence Family Homestead. The island had been rich with natural resources, with forests, rivers, lakes, and ores that laid deep beneath the ground. The workmen that helped the family had built their own accommodations, with these being bunkhouses, which would have been simple housing used to give the workers a place to sleep with security. However, something these workers hadn't been aware of had been their activities had attracted the attention of a large bear that began to rampage through their settlement, where it attacked those around it. The workers tried to drive the monstrosity away, some even shooting bullets at it. However, they soon found their efforts had no effect. Eventually, the bear had retreated back into the fog. It's unknown if the bear had managed to claim any of the workers' lives, but its presence had done work on their morale, as it had scared them all, and Spence's wife had fallen ill shortly after the attack, with a fever developing where she would also suffer from terrible nightmares. Spence becomes convinced that the bear had been an evil spirit dead set on killing his wife from within her mind, and so he comes up with a plan to find the beast and put an end to this madness. However, as Spence soon found, the workmen had been too terrified to find and kill the bear, as when it previously attacked, nothing they did to it seemed to have much effect on it. So Spence had crafted a bear spear and carved his own path through the snowy wilderness. Soon after his departure, his wife's fever had been broken, with her temperature turning back to normal. However, Spence was nowhere to be seen, and so the workmen summoned their courage and traveled in the same directions he did, until eventually they found Spence, or what was left of him, as they found him lying in the snow, half dead, as if hanging onto his life long enough for him to utter his last words. "Spear stole the bear's soul. My wife is free now." Once Spence had passed away, the men had taken the spear and buried him. In the years passing this event, a wealthy baron from the homestead would purchase the bear spear, which he had hung it in his hunting lodge. Spence's story would be passed from generation to generation, with the story becoming a local legend, the legend of the bear spear and the demon bear. However, one question had still lingered. Spence had been found, the fever had been broken, but the workers never confirmed the kill. So, where the bear's corpse had been had still been a complete mystery in the minds of the locals. Without Spence, the family too had faded away into legends, fading into the long dark. Over the years, more and more settlers would arrive from the mainland to construct new settlements such as Port Mary and Perseverance Mills along the north coast of the island. The construction and implementation of mining settlements would soon begin, with one being built by Ryan Thompson in Pleasant Valley. This settlement would be known as Thompson Crossing. The settlement would be a stone throws away from the newly implemented mine up the ridge of a cliffside. Eventually, the mine would connect Pleasant Valley to Coastal Highway. However, this route would not be used by pedestrians due to the dangers the mine may create. It is presumed that Ryan had passed away shortly after constructing the small settlement, which led to him getting a special walled-off grave away from the others with the tombstone reading, "Beloved Father, 1899. 12 years later in 1911, the town of Milton had been constructed within the region of Mountain Town as a coal mining town, which would give the other regions an abundance of coal. Over this time period, the population of the town would soar into the thousands margin, following the boom and bust culture of the island, where industrialization begins to take root, much to the dismay of some of the locals who begin to form an eco-activism group known as Forest Talkers, people who protest against such things. Within this part of the history, G.W. John had taken a team up into the mountainous region known as Black Rock and had found the perfect spot to begin construction of a prison. However, there was an obstacle afoot within the valley, with that being another community of trappers who had already built their cabins at the base of the mountain. So the workmen had gone out of their way to destroy these homes and cabins to make room for the foundations to be built for this new venture. To build the prison, the workers had outsourced materials from the outlying regions. However, stone had come from the local gold mine known as Last Prospect. During these times, mules had been essential in transporting goods across the region. However, no other activity was quite as demanding as the region of Black Rock due to the treacherous terrain, and it had been so harsh that even the animals found it difficult to haul the materials, and that wasn't including the harshness of the winter seasons to come. Throughout this era, engineers from the company Briar House had set up work in the design and construction of the railway line. The main purpose of this railway had been to connect Langston Mine all the way to Coastal Highway to make hauling materials easier and more efficient. The engineers, however, would find that the mountains had been barring this passage, so they made use of dynamite and detonators in order to clear tunnels out so the trains could go through them rather than around them. This technique is known as mountain blasting, which opened up new pathways into previously undiscovered regions, such as Mystery Lake, that remained untouched by the industrialization of mankind. Over the years of its grand opening, the railway line would be used to transport coal, uranium, timber, and workers to and from their destinations. Coming into the 1950s, Black Rock had attracted a wide array of wardens to take charge of the newly built prison, with some being empathetic towards the inmates and others showing nothing but cruelty towards them. It was also said that these wardens, however, relished in the extremes of the surrounding environment. Academics would also visit the prison since it held extensive records in its archive. The combination of the geographical location of the prison and the social isolation that came with it had led these scholars into various different scientific studies into the minds of the staff and the inmates they guarded. One in particular had been Dr. Child, who had been the medical director at the prison, which it had been rumored that due to his research, he was never really able to secure a new position back on the mainland. One of the longest serving officers in the prison had been famous for their skills in playing the piano to the inmates, which some saw this as therapeutic and others saw it as a form of punishment. However, there had been issues with the inmates just like any other prison, with some of them using improvised explosives as a form of currency. There were also issues with some of the guards going gold panning in their time off, which had been discouraged by the wardens, since they were afraid of losing men due to the possibility of them striking riches off the gold found in the river next to the prison. It was around this time that the Pleasant Valley farmstead had been constructed in the center of the region, with the farmers planting the seeds so that an orchard would grow, providing them with a harvest of apples in the future, which would provide the community with another economic boost, especially when they began to curate the land, fertilizing the soil ready for crops to be planted and maintained. As we come into the 1960s, the forest talkers would have another issue arise from the company Carter Hydro Energy that had been founded by Richard Carter, where they began constructing a new hydro dam in the Mystery Lake region, which Carter also planned to construct a new mining town in the vicinity as well, so that the dam could power it. The structure itself had been a prototype of its kind, however the seismic activity in the region and inaccessibility of the location made the construction stage quite difficult, and a new issue had arisen during this period with the price of coal diminishing quite considerably, which forced Carter to rethink his future endeavors, since the type of mining town he was going to build would be a coal mining town. Weighing the costs of the construction of the hydro dam and the future mining town, Carter had decided to abandon his plans, leaving the dam a husk of what could have been. Back in Milton, the locals had been busy throughout this time, where they had been replacing the dirt roads with paved ones between the town and the coastline, which would make traveling through the area easier to traverse. It is presumed that Will Mackenzie had been born in the late 60s, and his father had founded Jackrabbit Remote Transport. The exact dates of these events, however, are currently unknown. However, what we do know is that the remote transport had been ran as a family business and would be passed down to his son Will later in the timeline. In 1976, the staff at the Black Rock prison had desired to become solely independent in terms of power from the rest of the island, and so the warden had drawn up plans for a new power plant, a substation, and a set of steam tunnels in an effort to make the prison self-sustaining. Workers would man the substation that had been close to the prison's location to ensure the gates and the doors remained locked at Black Rock, and their accommodations would be a stone throw away from the substation in a trailer just down the road. It had been known that the task of manning the station had been a lonely one, and the electricians and line workers who filled those positions wouldn't be around for very long. A smart decision had been to construct electrical pylons in the case a blizzard rolls through the region. Then workers could follow these large structures to a set of shelters nearby, which would make them a survival asset in the event these storms arose. As we come into the 1980s, a new CEO for Carter Hydro Energy had risen through the ranks, who had been known as Robert Clark, and with this change of leadership came with it new attempts to pick up where the previous generation left off, with a desire to get the Carter Dam in Mystery Lake functional and online, and eventually construction would finish, but the team to manage the dam's function would be a skeleton crew, with only the required amount of workers necessary to maintain the dam being employed there. However, in some cases, progression could also mean stagnation, which would be true for the town of Milton, as during this time, the town would fall into a steady decline, with the Great Bear Highway being constructed, which crippled the town's level of importance, since previously the town had been used as a gateway town, but now the highway allowed those traveling to bypass the town entirely. In these years, a new publisher had risen up that was branded as Goose Books, who published their Small Arms Handbook, which would aid people in getting to grips with small firearms, such as pistols if need be. In 1982, the green light had been given from Jahn Industries to Dr. Rudiger to build a machine in Upper Great Bear that had been designed to study the natural geological cycles of the island. The aim was to collect data that would aid humanity in understanding the Earth's natural cataclysmic cycles, so mankind could be better prepared in the case of a next major end-of-world scenario. Little did they know the trouble one machine would cause cause for those who worked on the project and beyond. Over the course of several days, several teams of workers and security personnel had been flown to Field 31, along with supplies in preparation for the operation. A secret evacuation point, however, had been selected in the region just in case things went sideways. As it progresses, the operation begins to attract the attention of locals who can see the helicopters and planes flying over the mountains. However, this would be a non-issue as they would quickly lose interest in this phenomenon. It was said that this operation was to remain secretive. The company didn't want anyone outside of their choosing to know too much about their operations on the island. The workers eventually had finished their first task, which had been in building 4 bunkers on the island, which would be used for storage and housing of the workers and personnel, with these bunkers being labeled as Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Omega. Despite the secrecy, Captain Redrick had been stationed at Field 31, and he had grown suspicious over some interference on the radio signal, which had originated from the bunkers. However, these origin points remained undiscovered by him due to several transmitters requiring repairs. The security chief, Lena Vertisky, during this time had been flown out to Field 31 so that she could oversee the security in the mines that had been constructed in these days, which brings us into the events of the Tales from the Far Territory. Over the course of days, the miners had mapped out an area that looked to be a suitable location for where the machine would be stationed at, that had been located in a chamber above the mines near to the concentrator. Due to the urgency of the company, the miners and workers had been given more opportunities for extra work. However, this opportunity came with a few drawbacks. It would require the miners and workers to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and they wouldn't be allowed to leave the area or get paid until the work had been completed. Over the course of the operation, however, the cracks began to form between the teams, where the first and second team had nearly no issues at all in cooperating. However, they had been on shaky ground between each other, and the third team ended up getting quite angry where they refused to work, with them wanting to leave the island and go home, and others complained about the working conditions. These issues had escalated so much so that the chief had requested for more security forces to be flown in. The medical officer had conducted their own investigation into what had been transpiring, conducting interviews with the workers, and they made some troubling observations into the workers' morale. Despite these issues, work had continued as planned. 38 days into the project, Dr. Rudiger and his fellow associates had arrived in the area, where he had gotten the workers and miners to sign new paperwork. After this, the workers had installed a new track above the concentrator that led into the mountains in order to make hauling resources to the machine's chamber easier and less time-consuming. 15 days after this, earthquakes had ravaged the land, which destroyed a lot of the temporary scaffolding on the site. Despite these issues, work continued on the machine as planned. Most of the work on the machine, however, had been completed at this time, with enough power being supplied to it that it would be able to power an entire town through the winter season. Eventually, the teams had powered up the machine, which produced a blue fog, which would be later dubbed as the Glimmer Fog. The fog itself charged the air with electrostatic energy, which caused some adverse effects with those who had been exposed to it. The adverse effects had been recorded as a strange mental deterioration, with the affected losing memories as if the information had just fallen out of the affected's mind. Another symptom had been some strange fascination with water. Dr. Rudiger had made sure to keep himself away from those who had been affected by this strange new illness, and the workers and miners quickly had been confined to their quarters to stop them from wandering around. Soon after this, the illness begins to spread to other workers and the security detail. The management also begin to feel the early stages of this illness, with these being the foreman, the project medical officer, and the security chief, who began to suspect that Dr. Rudiger Rudiger had a cure to this new illness. At this time, it was unknown to everyone what had been causing this illness. An investigation had been carried out, but the only explanation that could be brought from it had to have been something within the mind to blame for this new outbreak. The medical officer concludes that the illness couldn't be a pathogen or a virus, since there hadn't been any damage to the bodies of those affected, and the only symptoms were psychological. But the medical officer holds out hope that treatment to this illness would be waiting for them as soon as they are taken away from the working environment. Eventually, the machine had been turned off, and Dr. Rudiger continued to keep to himself. Soon it becomes clear that the mine had been lost for good now. The security chief tries to reason with Dr. Rudiger in an attempt to get him to save the workers with the cure that she had suspected he had in his possession. But the doctor instead destroys much of the records so this couldn't fall back on him, and he then flees to the Sundered Pass with the data collected, with him covering his tracks by burning the boss's settlement. Eventually, a helicopter would transport some of the mentally ill workers. However, as fate would have it, the pilots lost control of the aircraft and they crashed into the mountains near the old coral. The survivors, however, wandered away from the crash site, and their whereabouts had become a mystery. While this happened, the security chief had wandered deeper into the mine in an attempt to destroy the machine. However, she soon loses what is left of her mind. The foreman, however, had been a mole the whole time for the company and had been given the task to track down the doctor and to find the data collected. Dr. Rudiger in his travels attempted to radio for his evacuation using a transmitter at the High Peak Plateau. However, it soon became apparent that help wasn't coming for him or for anyone. Eventually, after a cat and mouse game through the wilderness, the foreman tracks down Dr. Rudiger after he had been attacked by a cougar, and the two get into a fight, resulting in Dr. Rudiger shooting himself, and the foreman leaves the confines of the bunker, making a note of this memory before he too had lost himself to the fog, and the data had faded into the long dark. 2 years after these events, the glimmer fog still lingers within the air, with the region being named as the contamination zone, but it slowly begins to seep into the lower regions of the island, with some feeling the effects of the illness that plagued the miners. However, the newly affected individuals would be few and in between. In the same year, Goose Books had published a new book, with this one being Medicinal Plants of Great Bear. In 1985, Grey Mother had given her mother's pearls to her daughter Lilith on her 16th birthday. Lilith had told her parents of her dream to scale the summit of Milton Park. While her mother had been against the idea, her father Martin Barker had encouraged this idea. However, it turned out to be a bad one, as Lilith followed through on her father's input, and on her travels up the mountains, she slipped and fell straight to her death, with those she traveled with finding her body soon after losing her, which inadvertently drove a wedge between Martin and Grey Mother, which they soon separated from each other. While Grey Mother wanted the pearls to be buried with Lilith, Martin took them to remind him of his daughter's memory. Lilith would be buried at St. Christopher's Church, with her tombstone reading, "Our Fallen Angel." Grey Mother would continue to reside in her home in Milton House, while Martin moved to the outskirts of town in Paradise Meadows Farm. Grey Mother then began to shun most of the residents and held a great grudge upon the townsfolk in her grief. Eventually, the town gave her the name Grey Mother, which she would embrace the title later down the line. Over the rest of the 80s, Goose Books had released a sewing primer, advanced guns, field dressing your kill volume 1, frontier shooting guide, the frozen angler, staying on target, wilderness kitchen, and practical gunsmithing. Moving on into the 90s, regions such as Mystery Lake had been rocked by large earthquakes that caused significant damages to the Carter Dam, which resulted in the dam no longer being able to be manned safely, with the structure beginning to crumble, exposing the electrical wiring. The staff was soon told to pack up and leave due to the instability of the structure. It is rumored, however, that forest talkers had taken their activism to the next level by taking the workers hostage, and the company had to send someone to negotiate for their safe return, resulting in much of the equipment being left behind and the gates being locked. Despite of their disdain of industrialization, however, the forest talkers had then used the dams for their base of operations in an ironic twist. Eventually, Will Mackenzie and Astrid had gotten married, and their son had been born. But tragically, their son dies due to unknown causes, and like the Grey Mother and Martin Barker, the two had separated and divorced, but out of sentimental reasons, they both keep their wedding bands close by. Again, the exact dates to these events is unclear, and this part is just a presumption to have happened within these time frames. A traveler in these times had been traversing in the wilderness, leaving their journey's mark, with a diary page at the Mindful Cabin being left behind, and a buried page at the boss's settlement, before they headed into the Langston mine. Moving back to Blackrock, two convicts had made a miraculous escape into the wilderness during the summer season. However, after just 3 days, they found themselves unable to survive on the island with just their wits, and so they returned to the prison, begging the guards to let them back inside. Coming into the 2000s, a global economic crisis begins in the world due to the political and economic instability sweeping throughout the world. The US and Europe during these times had contributed to this in the financial markets, which eventually led to a catastrophic collapse of the Canadian banking system. The Canadian dollar value would fall to being equal to 23 cents in American currency. This time period would be known as the collapse. During these times, Mathis had been tried and found guilty of the crime of murder in Canada, which he would be sent to prison in Montreal with someone called Heller. However, the pair would later be sent to Blackrock Prison in Great Bear Island later down the line. Milton's population during this time had shrunk from being in the thousands to the low hundreds. As soon as the collapse had occurred, the major industries on the island had begun to crumble, with the businesses shutting their doors almost overnight. From Last Resort Cannery to the Hibernia Processing Center, the industries ceased to function. Bleak Inlet begins to crumble and rot away due to the lack of maintenance in the area. Desolate Point has a similar occurrence. However, one soul still lingers within the lonely lighthouse, continuing to provide maintenance to that structure. The coastal town site and fishing camps in Coastal Highway begin to see fewer travelers, and gas stations see fewer deliveries from the mainland. However, they tried to continue their businesses relying on the locals, but they too had no choice but to close their doors. The bank begins to repossess properties in Pleasant Valley. The Milton Post Office cannot send physical mail back to the mainland due to the lack of transportation, so they begin to urge the locals to make use of emails for their communication needs with the mainland. However, the mainland hadn't forgotten the locals of Great Bear. In fact, they would continue to send shipments to them, which had comprised of ration supplies, reminiscent of World War II standards. The communities during this time had split into two different ideological political sides, with one side viewing the mainland support as a type of charity in helping the locals. It was seen as an apology for the mainland exploitation of the resource-rich island, and the other side saw the dependency on the mainland to be a necessary evil, but they ultimately viewed the mainlanders with a degree of distrust, which soon grew into a deep hatred for them, with these locals cursing the day the mainlanders had come to their island. Many of these locals and the forest talkers had presumed the reason the mainlanders to come to the island in the future would only be to ravage the lands and to pillage the resources that laid bare there. However, other more open-minded locals had begun to leave their communities in search for mainland civilizations, which hurts the already diminished working force. However, the community in Pleasant Valley didn't feel that much of a change straight away, since they had been so accustomed to the remoteness of their living already. It would take them several years for them to actually feel the change. The residents of coastal towns would now have to live off of fishing in order to survive, rather than relying on the mainland trade. Eventually, the scars on the community would begin to form, with the locals beginning to stockpile and hoard supplies in case of another catastrophe to commence, with many people creating ashes. Martin Barker, on the other hand, had received an emergency kit from the Great Bear Memorial Society, and someone known as Hank in Mystery Lake had made his own preparations, with him sending word back to his niece to come and find him should things get worse for her. Even though the major industries had collapsed with the economic crisis, the Black Rock prison had remained open and continued to operate even without support from the mainland due to their self-sufficiency. But an uneasy truce had formed between the warden and the forest talkers, who began to operate within the vicinity. This was done in order to provide jobs and revenue within these stricken times. However, that wasn't to say that resentment hadn't begun to seep through the cracks of the walls, and the activists during this time had become experts on how to use the abandoned infrastructures to their advantage. Earthquakes during these times would continue to ravage the landscape, resulting in paths and bridges being crippled and destroyed. However, the warden had seen this as a blessing in disguise, since it would dissuade the prisoners from attempting to escape. After the collapse, however, the warden's home that resided outside the prison grounds had mysteriously caught fire and had been a victim of arson. However, the motive behind the crime was never found. In these times, the prison found itself short on food, which they weren't used to at all, and in the winter times this hurt even more so, with the officers and inmates having to make do with leaner rations. However, in an attempt to keep the pantries full, the kitchen staff had made their farming skills known. The newer guards had been awarded the task of supplementing the more meager food supply, which had been described as a thankless and often dangerous task. Breyer House at this time had continued their work as one of the few industries to remain open for business, where they continued harvesting the resources from the island, which stirred the attention of the forest talkers, with them organizing rallies against this type of action across Mystery Lake, Forlorn Muskeg, and the Broken Railroad. The forest talkers soon moved their headquarters to the old hunting lodge near to the Breyer House maintenance yard. Despite of the economic collapse, tourism still had occurred, although it just wasn't as plentiful as before, but this still provided a boost in revenue to the locals of the island, with people visiting the sites and regions the island had to offer. However, the seismic activity had dissuaded others from visiting the island. The most popular destinations had been Mystery Lake, Ash Canyon, and Timberwolf Mountain. The earthquakes then began again, causing havoc for the people of Milton, with it knocking out the main power supply, and the population shrunk even more so, with it becoming around 10 to 20 people, which transforms the once populated mining town into a ghost town. A man known as Manny Douglas had signed up for a wilderness survival experience. However, the company that provided the experience had delayed the return trip back to the mainland, which leaves him stranded for at least 7 business days, much to his dismay. This gets Manny so angry that he contacts his lawyer about this, since his exit plans were supposed to be locked in, and now he had been forced to stay with a group of locals who become annoyed with him as time progresses. A company known as the Mainland Power Corps during this time had sent in a recovery team in order to seize Martin's solar block model BK1, since he failed and refused to pay the bills that accumulated up to 1,256 Canadian dollars and 45 cents. Coming into 2012, an unusual spike in cold weather had been predicted for this year's coming winter, with heavy snow and record low temperatures to be expected. This results in plans to close Mystery Lake earlier than previously expected. On the 30th of June, the Great Bear Water Authority strikes a blow to the residents of Milton due to an outbreak of E. coli in the groundwater supply, which only added to the list of problems the town faced. 2 months later, the Milton Credit Union shuts down due to the reality of the economic failings. During this time, a hiker had made their way to Timberwolf Mountain, where they make use of a mountaineer's hut to rest. However, they soon hear a deafening sound that seemed to originate from the summit of the mountain. A couple of days later, the hiker goes to investigate, where they find several cargo containers that weren't there before. In November 2012, a group of unknown individuals had devised a plan to stay in Mystery Lake in secret, despite of the park being planned to close for the season. And now the blizzard begins to roll in, which blocks off the roads in some of the regions like Pleasant Valley, which Father Thomas had made note of. Approximately around this time, Jane Yang had contacted Astrid, pleading with her, begging her to bring a cure to Perseverance Mills after a disease had surfaced and overtook her home. Astrid had accepted her cries for help and had stolen a cure to a disease, taking it to Jack Rabbit Remote Transport, which brings us into the events of Wintermute.
Jack Rabbit Remote Transport, Mackenzie speaking.
I told her not to come up. I told her you couldn't fly in this weather. For once, will you not be so damn
Whoa,
stubborn?
whoa, slow down, Maureen. What are you talking about?
She just showed up. Said you'd see her. Said you'd fly her north. I know you need the money. The weather service...
It's okay, Maureen. I've got it from here.
Hello, Will.
What are you doing here?
It's been a while, I know.
Yeah. Years. I haven't heard from you since...
I know. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't important.
Well... What brings you... I mean... Are you sick?
No, not me. But I need to get to someone who is.
Right. So you're still a doctor?
Yes, I'm still a doctor.
I thought that after... Why are you here?
I need your help. There's an isolated community in the northern part of Great Bear. Someone there is very sick.
Great Bear? There's nothing there anymore. Not since...
I know. But I have to get there.
Still trying to save the world, huh?
Somebody has to.
What's that supposed to mean?
Mackenzie... Will... I didn't come here to fight about the past. I need a pilot to take me somewhere remote. Someone who won't ask too many questions. Someone I can trust.
Wait, questions? Astrid, are you in trouble?
Are you gonna help me, or not?
What's in the case?
See, there's that thing about no questions, remember?
What's in the case, Astrid?
No questions.
Look, the weather out there is bad. Bad. But it's getting worse. You walk in here after years. I could have been dead. You could have been. And then you show up and you want me to just risk my life flying into the middle of the great northern nowhere to deliver you in some mystery metal case to some remote wilderness outpost, all because you walked in here and asked me to?
Yes.
Astrid, you can't bring him back.
This isn't about that.
I know how hard it's been.
No. You don't know, Mackenzie. You don't know anything.
You don't think I feel it too?
Are you gonna take me or not? The longer I wait, the worse it'll get. Damn it. I don't have time for this.
Wait. The worse what we'll get? Why do I have a feeling you're not talking about the weather?
Because I'm not.
Throw your bags in the plane. I'll get started on pre-flight. Better buckle up tight, because it's going to be a rough ride.
As Will and Astrid had been taking off the runway, a prison bus holding 15 convicts had been scheduled to arrive at Black Rock. However, they would never arrive, as unknown to everyone, a heavy windstorm had descended down onto the island, and just when Will had been flying over the mountains of Great Bear Island, a massive solar flare had occurred, shutting down the engine of the plane, short-circuiting the plane's instruments, and forcing them to crash land on the side of a mountain.
Shut up for a second. Something's wrong.
That is not good.
What's going on?
Power's gone. Whole electrical system looks fried.
Shit! What's happening?
No power means we're going down. Hold tight.
Will?
However, this wasn't something that just affected him. The electronics had stopped working across the entire island and northern Canada, leading into blackouts and a loss of communications, bringing humanity back to the Dark Ages. The flare had also caused a disruption in the Earth's weather patterns, bringing on extreme temperature changes and brutal snowstorms to roll in more frequently. Auroras would even form more frequently as well, which appeared like a bright and colourful curtain in the night skies, which would have an effect on the electronics in the world, reviving them to a certain extent, which allowed them to operate for as long as the aurora had been around. But once it faded, so did the energy that powered the electronics. It is theorized that the first flare had done considerable damage to the Earth's magnetic polarity fields, which would explain the sudden shifts in weather and the longer winter in the northern poles. The behavior of the wildlife too had been disrupted by this event, which would be most notable in the predators, as before they had avoided humans, but now they seemed more aggressive towards them, with these predators stalking and attacking people on sight. Bears had awoken from hibernation early and began routinely roaming the island's regions. Timber wolf packs began attacking people across Pleasant Valley and Black Rock. These wolves had attacked Molly's husband after his hunting rifle exploded in his hands, where in the midst of the attack he calls out for Molly, begging her to help him in fending off the wolves, but she just lets the wolves have their way with him. After the wolves had their meal, Molly had taken his remains, storing them in the farmhouse cellar, and covers it up. On that night, a woman known as Alice had gotten separated from the other residents who had been fleeing the area. She becomes lost, but she soon finds a cave to act as her shelter. But unfortunately, the cave soon becomes her final resting place, as the cold became too much for her body to handle. Due to the loss of electricity, severe weather, food, and water shortages, looting and violence became rampant throughout most of the affected regions. Dozens of motorists had become stranded on highways and roads since their vehicles stopped working, where these people all began making their way off the highway and to the town of Milton. Multiple earthquakes began destroying the Trans-Island Railway line, the highway, and other essential paths and access ways. Some hikers heading towards Timberwolf Mountain and find themselves lost at the point of disagreement after crashing their cars. Most of the infrastructure of the island becomes either heavily damaged or buried in landslides and avalanches. Connections between regions that were once seamless had now been cut off, making traveling using these paths impossible, forcing travelers to make use of more dangerous routes, such as abandoned mine shafts and cave systems. In other areas, such as Milton, rope climbing gear is required in order to leave or enter the area due to how isolated the location had become. It is due to this fact that Grey Mother believes that Milton is now doomed, since the town had been completely cut off from the outside world. Moving back to Black Rock, the prisoners use the loss of power to their advantage, where they break out of their cells and begin fighting back against the prison staff members, turning the tables on the officers and executing them in the process. They turn the prison into their own own private fortress, where they use it as their base of operations as they begin scouring the wilderness and looting the nearby locals. The warden of the prison, Franklin, had been taken hostage by the prisoners in the hostile takeover. Jace at this time had been traveling through Black Rock in her car on her way to Perseverance Mills, but because the solar flare hits, her car ceases to function, so she begins making her way to the prison for shelter, only to find its current state as the prisoner's fortress, and so she hides in the nearby towers. The prison bus that had been carrying 15 convicts had crashed into the entrance of the collapsed tunnel outside of Milton, where some of the convicts had survived and make their escape into the frozen tundra, where they would make their way into Milton, holding the remaining residents hostage in the old schoolhouse before they ransack the town. But once the Aurora arrives, the electrics come back, which causes exposed electrical wiring to begin emitting sparks that eventually cause the schoolhouse to catch on fire, with everyone still trapped inside. After the crash, Astrid had made her way to Milton, where she tried to save those trapped by the flames, but there was ultimately nothing that she could do, as the residents had perished and the convicts responsible had scattered away. One convict did try his luck by breaking into Grey Mother's home, but once he came eye to eye with the mother, she shot and killed him. Astrid then encounters one of the convicts for herself, where she attacks Hobbs, stabbing him with a knife before running out of the town, while being injured herself, where she makes her way into the crashed prison bus before the tunnel had fully collapsed. After leaving a message in her blood for Will, she makes her way through the tunnel before passing out at Keeper's Pass South, which is a small crossroads in the mountains connecting Milton, Black Rock, and Pleasant Valley. However, there had been other convicts that didn't travel into Milton but away from it, with these being Heller, Mathis, and Vachon, and some others where they made their way to Pleasant Valley in the coming days. But Mathis had continued on his own, making his way to the Carter Hydro Dam in Mystery Lake, where he meets a woman, presumably a forest talker, but he soon ends her with his own hands. One of the convicts on their travels through Pleasant Valley, however, did meet their end by the work of an archer in the region. One of the residents of Milton, however, did manage to escape the convicts after being attacked, managing to make their way as far as Forlon Muskeg, but they eventually succumb to their wounds and die by blood loss in the following day. The wolves at this time begin overtaking Mountain Town, where they find Martin Barker at Paradise Meadows Farm, resulting in his death. As the Aurora passes over the island, the workers at the maintenance yard notice the lights in the sky and the correlation with the disruption of their equipment and other electronics. They try using the radios to call for help and plan to stay indoors until help finds them, but eventually they leave the confines of the maintenance yard and move into the woods in order to survive. One of the workers, however, saw a forest talker and attempted to murder them for all of the eco-terrorism they had been causing. In the fight, the forest talker had managed to defend themselves, but had been wounded in the process. As day had broken in, Will Mackenzie had climbed out of the ravine that was near the crash site of his plane, and had begun his narrow journey towards the town of Milton. Mackenzie eventually finds the prison bus and Astrid's message written in her blood, with the message being something that alluded to her survival. Mackenzie then manages to rescue Jeremiah from the old bear in Mystery Lake, where he spent the next few days nursing him back to health. Over the weekend, the sun becomes more active in the skies, but something else happens in those skies, with North Star Charters Flight 7030 falling out of the sky, where it crashes near Skeeter's Ridge in Pleasant Valley. Upon impact, the plane had torn apart, with half of the passengers dying in the crash. Those who survived the crash had managed to walk away from it and made their way to Thompson's Crossing. However, some had become lost as they traveled, becoming separated from the others. After this, Astrid had awoken in the Pleasant Valley farmstead after being rescued by Molly, where she had made her way to Signal Hill in hopes that she could contact Perseverance Mills during an aurora. Mackenzie, on the other hand, had managed to find and kill the old bear, but he passes out and later awakens to the shortwave radio Jeremiah had built. But due to the aurora, it was now functional. So Mackenzie takes advantage of the situation and he calls Perseverance Mills before it was too late.
The radio. It's working. Damn. Why can't I get anything?
Come in, this is Perseverance Mills?
Hello?
Come in. Hello?
Can anyone hear me?
Is this the radio station at Perseverance Mills?
Can you hear me?
We need help. There's some kind of quarantine situation. Hello?
Mackenzie.
What do you mean quarantine?
Mackenzie, is that you?
Is there a doctor with you? We need a doctor or medical assistance, anything.
I can hear him, but he can't hear me.
We're cut off.
You're alive. Damn it, Mackenzie. You're alive.
What's in the case?
I have no idea.
Don't worry, pilot. You'll be with her soon.
The following day, Vajon, Hella, and Mathis had found Will's location, where they put him on a stretcher and tied his hands up before carrying him out into the wilderness. As they make their way through the Keeper's Pass north, Will wakes up to find himself being taken somewhere against his will. But the group soon find themselves at odds with a pack of timber wolves, where they begin to attack them, which gives Will the chance he needs to escape. However, the break for freedom is short-lived, as the others had fended off the wolves and caught up with Will, knocking him down, and subsequently take him to Black Rock Prison.
Looks like I finally found a use for your metal case. We have unfinished business, pilot. Stick around.
Later in the day, Mackenzie wakes up in a prison cell and had been greeted by Franklin, the former warden, before the criminal takeover. He tells Will that the convicts are only keeping him alive because they are attempting to release a prisoner named Donna from the solitary confinement wing of the prison, but they cannot get inside, and they believe Franklin to be hiding how to get inside from them. Donna is the son of Mathis, who is even more psychotic than his father. Before the first flare, he had been serving a life sentence. Their conversation, however, is cut short by the arrival of Mathis, Vashon, and Hella, where they watch Mathis begin to beat Franklin to an inch of his life. The other two had then patched up the warden, but they require medicine in order to complete the treatment. Will volunteers for the task to find the medicine outside the prison walls, and the two convicts let him loose without Mathis's approval. They do this knowing that Will won't run away because they have Astrid's hard case. Will makes his way outside of the prison, and on his travels, he meets a woman on the phone who had been Jace, who had been actively trying to stop the convicts' plans to free Donna since her arrival. In their conversation, she questions what side Will is on, and she then realizes that the pilot might be able to help her after all. Eventually, Will finds the Black Rock Infirmary medication and returns to administer the medicine to Franklin. Will tells Franklin of the woman he had spoken to in his search for the medicine, and that she is trying to help them both. Mackenzie hatches a plan for a prison break, but these plans are soon foiled when Mathis discovers them and puts Will to work inside the steam tunnels in an effort to get them repaired so he can power up the prison and reroute power to the solitary wing. When Will arrives at the steam tunnels, he is contacted by Jace again, where she tells him to sabotage the tunnels, which is what he does, which results in their complete destruction, which alerts Mathis to the prospect of there being a spy spy, trying to thwart his plans to free his son. Unknown to Mathis of who sabotaged the tunnels, he gives Will a new task to find the detonators in the Last Prospect mine. But as soon as he leaves the prison, Mathis turns towards Franklin once again. But this time the beating was even worse, to the point Mathis had gotten some more information out of Franklin in a bid to save his own life. He turns on Will, telling Mathis about the alliance with the woman on the phone, but not even that could save him from Mathis, as he murders Franklin. After Will finds the detonators and returns to the surface, Jace calls him again, where it is revealed that she had been driving to Perseverance Mills to meet her thesis professor Atwood. Will tells her that he is also seeking Atwood to deliver a message to her. Jace also tells him of the Suzuki radio telescope being located near to the mills, that it had been shielded from EMPs, so there is a chance that anything electronic inside would still work. But she also tells Will that she cannot allow the convicts to find that place, as it has plenty of supplies, radios, working vehicles, and other resources that are invaluable to a group's survival. But if the convicts were to find that, then it would allow them to rule the island with an iron fist. Jace had also been aware that Mackenzie needs to get his hard case back from Mathis, and will be delivering the detonators to him soon. She then reveals to Will that her plans will now need to go nuclear, as she has an ace up her sleeve.
So, pilot, did you finish the job?
I found the detonators.
Well, I guess the warden was telling the truth after all.
Now what?
Now, we blow a hole in the wall. But first, let's you and I have a little chat.
Hey! Mathis! I did everything you asked.
Oh, I know, pilot. You've been a good dog. But every dog has its day.
Whoa. Wait, fellas.
Mathis then attacks Will, going in for the kill, but the fight is soon interrupted by an explosion that rocks the prison, where Jace activates the prison lockdown procedures, which buys Will some time, where she reveals her nuclear plan was to destroy the prison by blowing it up. Will then finds Astrid's hard case in the warden's office before escaping out into the cold once again. Jace then calls Will, telling him to meet her at the power plant, but as he does, Mathis tracks the pair down before Hella reveals that Donna had been set free but is badly wounded and is dying, which sends Mathis into a blind rage, poised to kill both Will and Jace, but they both manage to knock him back before Will and Jace fall into the power plant river to escape the convicts. Meanwhile, Astrid had arrived in Perseverance Mills with the use of a canoe, where two men approach her, believing at first that she had been a quarantine breaker, but they soon realize that she isn't from the mills. She is soon approached by Jane, who is surprised to see Astrid alive, but is confused since Astrid doesn't hold her hard case by her side. After falling into the river, Jace and Will wash up on the riverbank, forcing them onto that freezing cold snow, but they soon summon what little strength they have left so they can traverse the wilderness once again as they journey towards Perseverance Mills with hard case in hand. And now the tale is yours to tell. Within the stories of the survival mode, how far will you travel into the long dark? What stories will you craft? What hardships will you endure in your time of survival? That, I think, is for you to decide. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you thought of the stories in the long dark in the comments below, and I look forward to hearing from you. Subscribe for more content like this in the future, and if you would like your name up here too, along with more exclusive content, then click on the join button and become a member today. And thank you to the members of the channel in giving your support to the channel, and I hope to see you all back here on the next one. And be sure to leave this video having a good one.